The red phone hadn't rung in Washington for 3 years. When it did, at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October, the sound cut through the Pentagon's night shift like a scream. In the secure translation booth on the 4th floor, Elena Vasquez, jolted awake at her desk, her coffee cup clattering against the stack of routine diplomatic cables she'd been reviewing. The emergency klaxon that followed the phone made her blood run cold. Something was happening in Moscow. Something that required immediate translation. And in that moment, Elena had no idea that her fluency in 7 languages and her ability to catch the subtle nuances that others missed would be the only thing standing between 2 superpowers and nuclear catastrophe. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the Pentagon's translation center hummed with the same monotonous persistence that had marked Elena Vasquez's career for the past 6 years. She sat hunched over her desk in the cramped booth that served as her office, surrounded by dictionaries in 12 languages and stacks of routine diplomatic correspondence that most people would find mind-numbing. But Elena found beauty in the subtle differences between languages, the way a single word could carry entirely different meanings depending on context, cultural background, and even the speaker's emotional state. At 32, Elena possessed what her linguistics professors at Georgetown had called an almost supernatural ability to decode not just words, but the intentions behind them. She could identify regional dialects within dialects, catch cultural references that would slip past native speakers from different backgrounds, and most importantly, she could sense when someone was lying, scared, or desperate simply by the way they structured their sentences in a foreign language. These skills had made her invaluable to the State Department's translation services, but they had also made her invisible. While male colleagues with half her qualifications were promoted to senior analyst positions, Elena remained classified as a language support specialist, a title that made her sound more like a secretary than the linguistic expert she actually was. Her supervisor, Director James Morrison, treated her like a piece of office equipment, useful when needed, but hardly worth acknowledging as a human being with insights that might extend beyond simple word-for-word translation. Morrison was a career bureaucrat who had never learned a second language beyond high school Spanish, but he managed the translation department with the confidence of someone who believed that all foreign languages were just English with different words. Elena's colleagues weren't much better. The department was dominated by men who had come up through traditional diplomatic channels, most of whom viewed translation as a necessary evil rather than a skilled profession. They would drop urgent documents on her desk without explanation, expecting perfect translations within impossible timeframes, then take credit for her work when briefing senior officials. Dr. Richard Hawthorne, the department's chief analyst, was particularly dismissive. He had a habit of speaking about Elena in the third person, even when she was standing right next to him, referring to her as the translator, as if she were a machine rather than a person with advanced degrees in linguistics, international relations, and Slavic studies. When Elena occasionally tried to offer context or cultural insight that might affect the interpretation of a document, Hawthorne would cut her off with a wave of his hand and a patronizing smile. The morning that would change everything started. Like every other morning in Elena's career, she arrived at the Pentagon at 6:30 a.m., 2 hours before her official start time, because she had learned that the quiet morning hours were the only time she could work without interruption. The security guards at the entrance knew her by name, but they were among the few people in the building who treated her with basic courtesy. Elena's workspace was a testament to her dedication and her department's indifference. While senior analysts enjoyed spacious offices with windows, Elena worked in a converted supply closet that had been hastily fitted with a desk, a computer, and shelving for her reference materials. The walls were covered with linguistic charts, cultural calendars, and maps marked with regional dialect boundaries. Most of her colleagues assumed these were just decorative, but Elena used them daily to provide context that could mean the difference between accurate translation and dangerous misunderstanding. Her first task of the day was reviewing overnight cables from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. The diplomatic relationship between the United States and Russia had been deteriorating for months, and the volume of communications had increased dramatically. Most of the messages were routine trade disputes, visa issues, complaints about media coverage, but Elena had begun to notice subtle patterns in the language that suggested something deeper was happening. The Russian diplomats were using increasingly formal language structures, reverting to older, more traditional phrasings that hadn't been common in official communications for decades. To most translators, this would seem like a simple stylistic choice, but Elena recognized it as a sign of stress. In Russian culture, formal language was often a defensive mechanism, a way of creating emotional distance when discussing sensitive topics. More concerning was the frequency of certain words and phrases that appeared innocuous in translation, but carried heavy cultural weight in Russian. References to historical precedents and defensive necessities were appearing in contexts that seemed unrelated to their literal meaning. Elena had compiled a list of these linguistic anomalies, but when she had tried to discuss them with Dr. Hawthorne, he had dismissed her concerns as overthinking. Elena was deep in her analysis when Director Morrison appeared at her cubicle entrance, holding a thick folder marked with classification stamps. He looked irritated, as if her presence in the building was somehow an inconvenience to him. "Vasquez," he said without preamble, "I need you to handle this priority translation." The Russians sent over some technical documents related to their NUCL-EAR inspection protocols. Should be straightforward stuff, but the State Department wants it done by someone with security clearance. Elena accepted the folder and immediately noticed its weight. Technical documents were typically dense and complex, requiring not just linguistic skill, but deep understanding of specialized terminology. She opened the folder and saw immediately that these weren't routine inspection protocols. The documents were marked with classification levels she had never seen before, and the Russian text was filled with technical terms that seemed to be deliberately obscure. "Director Morrison," Elena said carefully, "these documents appear to be related to active nuclear systems rather than inspection protocols. The terminology suggests they might be operational manuals or maintenance procedures. I think this might require consultation with our nuclear specialists to ensure accurate translation." Morrison's expression soured. "Vasquez, I didn't ask for your analysis. I asked for translation. These people at State aren't paying for your opinions about what the documents might be about. They're paying for you to convert Russian words into English words. Can you do that, or do I need to find someone else?" Elena felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but she persisted. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sir, I understand the request, but accurate translation of technical documents requires understanding the context. If I translate these terms incorrectly, it could lead to serious misunderstandings about Russian nuclear capabilities. Let me be clear," Morrison said, his voice taking on the tone he used when he wanted to remind people of the hierarchy. "Your job is to translate words. Other people's jobs are to understand what those words mean. Stay in your lane, Vasquez. These documents need to be done by noon." Elena watched him walk away, then looked down at the documents again. The first page contained what appeared to be a maintenance schedule for something called perimeter system components. The term made her stomach clench. In her graduate studies of Soviet military history, she had come across references to a perimeter system that was rumored to be an automated nuclear retaliation system designed to launch nuclear weapons even if the Soviet leadership was dead or incapacitated. The system was supposed to be a Cold War legend, a doomsday device that existed more in Western imagination than in reality. But the technical language in these documents suggested otherwise. The maintenance procedures were too detailed, too specific to be describing a theoretical system. Someone in Russia was maintaining hardware that could potentially launch nuclear weapons without human intervention. Elena spent the next 3 hours working through the documents, and with each page, her concern grew. The technical specifications described a system that was not only real but apparently still active. The maintenance schedules indicated regular testing of communication links, sensor arrays, and most disturbingly, response protocols that seemed to be designed to function independently of human oversight. By the time she finished the translation, Elena was certain that she was looking at documentation for an active automated nuclear system. The implications were staggering. If the perimeter system was real and operational, it meant that Russia possessed the capability to launch nuclear weapons, even in scenarios where their entire government and military leadership had been eliminated. Elena printed out her translation and added a cover memo explaining her concerns about the document's implications. She walked to Dr. Hawthorne's office, hoping that the gravity of the situation would override his usual dismissiveness. Hawthorne was on the phone when she arrived, but he waved her in and gestured for her to sit. Elena waited while he finished a conversation about lunch plans, then handed him the translated documents along with her memo. "Dr. Hawthorne," she began, "I've completed the translation of the Russian technical documents, but I have serious concerns about their content. These appear to be maintenance procedures for an automated nuclear retaliation system. If this system is operational, it represents a significant shift in nuclear doctrine that could affect strategic stability." Hawthorne glanced at her memo for perhaps 10 seconds, then set it aside. "Vasquez, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you're not a nuclear strategist, you're a translator. These documents are probably just routine maintenance procedures for some kind of communications equipment. The Russians love to make everything sound more dramatic than it actually is. Sir, I don't think this is routine communications equipment. The technical terminology specifically refers to launch protocols and targeting systems. The maintenance schedule includes testing of autonomous response capabilities that seem designed to function without human authorization." Hawthorne's expression shifted from dismissive to annoyed. "Vasquez, let me explain something to you. The people who need to understand these documents are nuclear experts, not language experts. Your job is to provide accurate translations. My job is to determine their significance. I've been analyzing Soviet and Russian military documents for 15 years. I think I can distinguish between routine maintenance procedures and doomsday weapons." Elena felt her frustration building, but she tried to remain professional. "I understand your expertise, sir, but linguistic analysis can provide important context for technical documents. The specific terminology being used here isn't consistent with routine maintenance procedures. The Russians are using language that implies active operational systems rather than theoretical or historical ones." "Thank you for the language lesson," Hawthorne said with barely concealed condescension. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have real work to do. Please make sure the translations are properly formatted and submitted to the State Department by the deadline." Elena left Hawthorne's office feeling the familiar combination of frustration and helplessness that had defined her career. She had done her job, translated the documents accurately, but she had also identified what could be a critical threat to national security. The problem was that no one in the chain of command seemed interested in hearing insights that came from someone classified as language support. She returned to her cubicle and spent the rest of the morning reviewing her translation, double-checking every technical term and cultural reference. The more she studied the documents, the more convinced she became that they described an active nuclear system. The maintenance schedules were too current, the technical specifications too detailed, and the language too operational to be describing anything other than a functioning weapons system. Elena had learned to trust her instincts about language, and her instincts were screaming that these documents represented something dangerous. But she also knew that her concerns would be dismissed as long as they came from someone with her title and position in the hierarchy. The afternoon brought a steady stream of routine translation requests, trade agreements, diplomatic protests, cultural exchange proposals. Elena worked through them mechanically, but her mind kept returning to the nuclear documents. She found herself analyzing every word choice, every grammatical structure, looking for clues that might confirm or refute her interpretation. At 4:30 p.m., she received an unexpected visitor. General Patricia Hayes, the Pentagon's Deputy Director for Strategic Planning, appeared at Elena's cubicle with a folder under her arm. Elena had never spoken to General Hayes directly, but she knew the woman's reputation as someone who had risen through the ranks by being smarter and more thorough than her colleagues. "Ms. Vasquez," General Hayes said, "I understand you translated some Russian technical documents this morning. I'd like to discuss your interpretation of them." Elena felt a surge of hope. Finally, someone with real authority was interested in her analysis. "Yes, General. I believe those documents describe an operational automated nuclear system. The technical terminology and maintenance schedules suggest that the Russians have an active system capable of launching nuclear weapons without human intervention." General Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "That's consistent with intelligence reports we've been receiving from other sources. The problem is that we can't get confirmation from the translation department. Dr. Hawthorne insists that the documents describe routine communications equipment." "General, I can assure you that these documents are not describing communications equipment. The technical terms specifically refer to launch protocols, targeting systems, and autonomous response capabilities. The maintenance schedules include regular testing of systems that are clearly designed to function independently." "I believe you," General Hayes said, "but I need more than your word to convince the Joint Chiefs. Hawthorne has been the department's chief analyst for a decade. He has credibility with senior leadership that you, unfortunately, don't have." Elena felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but General Hayes continued, "However, I also know that Hawthorne has never been particularly strong on technical translations. His expertise is in political and diplomatic documents, not military hardware. What I need from you is a detailed analysis that I can present to the Joint Chiefs as evidence that these documents deserve serious attention." "General, I'd be happy to provide that analysis, but I should mention that I've already tried to raise these concerns with my supervisors. They weren't interested in my interpretation of the document's significance." General Hayes smiled grimly. "Ms. Vasquez, I've been fighting bureaucracy in this building for 20 years. I know how to get around supervisors who can't see past their own assumptions. What I need from you is a comprehensive report that analyzes not just the literal translation, but the cultural and linguistic context that supports your interpretation." Elena spent the next 2 hours preparing the most detailed analysis of her career. She broke down every technical term, explained the cultural significance of various linguistic choices, and provided historical context for the references that appeared throughout the documents. She cross-referenced her translation with technical manuals, historical documents, and intelligence reports that were available through the Pentagon's classified database. The result was a 20-page report that built a compelling case for the existence of an active Russian automated nuclear system. Elena had identified specific terminology that couldn't be explained by routine maintenance procedures, linguistic patterns that suggested operational rather than theoretical systems, and cultural references that implied the system was not only real but actively maintained. General Hayes reviewed the report that evening and scheduled a meeting with the Joint Chiefs for the following morning. Elena went home that night feeling more optimistic than she had in years. Finally, someone with Real authority was taking her expertise seriously. The next morning, Elena arrived at work to find Director Morrison waiting at her desk with a disciplinary notice. "Vasquez," he said without preamble, "I understand you've been sharing classified translations with unauthorized personnel." Elena felt her stomach drop. "Sir, I provided analysis to General Hayes at her request. She has appropriate security clearance and legitimate need for the information. General Hayes may have security clearance, but she doesn't have authority over translation department personnel. Your job is to translate documents and submit them through proper channels. You don't have authority to provide independent analysis." To military leadership. "Director Morrison, the General specifically requested my analysis because she was concerned about the accuracy of the official interpretation. I was trying to ensure that critical information wasn't being misunderstood." Morrison's expression hardened. "Vasquez, let me be very clear. Your job is to translate words from one language to another. You are not a strategic analyst. You are not a nuclear expert. You are not qualified to interpret the significance of classified documents. When you exceed your authority, you create confusion and undermine the credibility of this department." Elena realized that her moment of hope had been short-lived. The bureaucratic hierarchy that had kept her invisible for 6 years was reasserting itself. "Sir, I understand the chain of command, but I also understand that accurate translation requires cultural and linguistic context. If my analysis can help prevent misunderstandings about critical national security issues, isn't that worth considering?" "What's worth considering," Morrison said, "is whether someone who can't follow simple instructions should continue working in a classified environment. This is a formal reprimand, Vasquez. One more incident of unauthorized communication with senior personnel, and you'll be looking for a new job." Elena accepted the disciplinary notice and watched Morrison walk away. She understood the message clearly: stay in your lane, do your job, and don't cause trouble by thinking too much about the implications of your work. But as she sat in her converted supply closet, surrounded by the linguistic tools that had defined her career, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. The Russian nuclear documents weren't routine maintenance procedures, and her analysis had identified specific threats that could affect millions of lives. The problem was that no one in authority seemed interested in hearing warnings from someone with her title and position. Elena opened her computer and began working through the morning's translation requests, but her mind kept returning to the nuclear documents. She had done everything right: identified a potential threat, provided detailed analysis, and attempted to communicate her concerns through proper channels. The system had rejected her input not because it was wrong, but because it came from someone who wasn't supposed to have opinions about anything beyond word-for-word translation. As the morning wore on, Elena found herself analyzing not just the documents on her desk, but the entire structure that had defined her career. She was a highly educated professional with expertise that could contribute to national security, but she was trapped in a role that treated her as nothing more than a human translation machine. Her insights were dismissed, her analysis was unwelcome, and her warnings were ignored. But Elena also knew that her linguistic skills had revealed something that traditional intelligence analysis had missed. The Russian nuclear documents contained information that could be critical to understanding a potential threat, and she was the only person in the building who seemed to recognize its significance. The question was whether she would continue to accept the limitations that others had placed on her role, or whether she would find a way to ensure that her warnings reached someone who could act on them. Elena had spent 6 years being invisible, but she was beginning to realize that invisibility might be exactly what she needed to do something that mattered. As she worked through the morning's routine translations, Elena began to formulate a plan. She couldn't change the bureaucratic hierarchy that had kept her marginalized, but she could use her knowledge of the system to work around it. She had access to classified information, She understood the implications of what she had discovered, and she had the linguistic skills to confirm or refute her analysis. Most importantly, she had something that her supervisors lacked: the ability to recognize when language revealed truths that went beyond simple translation. The Russian documents had told her a story that went far beyond their literal meaning, and Elena was beginning to understand that she might be the only person who could read that story correctly. The afternoon brought news that confirmed Elena's worst fears. Intelligence reports from multiple sources were indicating unusual activity at Russian nuclear facilities. Satellite imagery showed increased movement at missile sites and communications. Intercepts suggested that Russian nuclear forces were conducting unscheduled readiness exercises. Elena watched as senior analysts tried to piece together the meaning of these developments, but she could see that they were missing the critical context that the technical documents had provided. The increased activity wasn't random, it was part of a systematic preparation for activating the automated nuclear system that Elena had identified. Dr. Hawthorne briefed senior leadership on the Russian activity, but his analysis focused on traditional explanations, political posturing, military exercises, or responses to international pressure. He didn't mention the automated nuclear system because he had dismissed Elena's translation as routine maintenance procedures. Elena realized that she was watching the intelligence failure unfold in real time. The information needed to understand. The Russian activity was available, but it was being ignored because it came from someone whose opinions weren't valued. The system was failing not because the information wasn't there, but because the people in charge couldn't see past their own assumptions about who was qualified to provide analysis. As the day ended, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't change the system that had marginalized her, but she could use her position within that system to access information that might be critical to national security. She had been invisible for 6 years, but she was about to discover that invisibility could be a powerful tool when used correctly. Elena gathered her materials and began to prepare for a long night of work. She had identified a potential threat that could affect millions of lives, and she was the only person in the building who seemed to understand its significance. The question was whether she would continue to accept the limitations that others had placed on her role, or whether she would find a way to act on the knowledge that her linguistic skills had revealed. The choice, Elena realized, was between remaining safely invisible or stepping into the light to prevent a catastrophe that no one else seemed to see coming. As she looked around her cramped workspace, surrounded by the tools of her trade, Elena knew that her career as a translator was about to become something much more dangerous and much more important. The red phone might not have rung yet, but Elena could hear its echo in the language patterns she had been studying. Something was building in Moscow, something that traditional intelligence analysis was missing, and Elena was beginning to understand that she might be the only person who could prevent it from happening. Her linguistic skills had revealed a truth that others couldn't see, and Elena was about to discover that the ability to read between the lines in multiple languages could be the most powerful weapon in the world. The question was whether she would have the courage to use it when everything she had worked for was at stake. The clock on her wall read 5:47 p.m., and Elena could hear the sound of her colleagues leaving for the day. Soon, she would be alone, in the building with access to classified information that could change the course of history. The translator, who had been dismissed as just language support, was about to become the most important person in the building, whether anyone else realized it or not. Elena opened her computer and began to access the classified databases that contained the information she needed. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the confidence of someone who had spent years navigating the Pentagon's digital systems. But her mind was focused on the linguistic patterns that had revealed a truth too dangerous to ignore. The story of her career was about to change from one of quiet frustration to one of decisive action. Elena had spent 6 years being underestimated, But she was about to prove that the person who understands the language often understands the truth better than the people who make the decisions. The emergency alert that shattered the Pentagon's pre-dawn silence on Thursday morning sent shockwaves through every classified corridor in the building. Elena had been at her desk since 4 a.m., cross-referencing Russian communications intercepts with the technical documents she'd translated too. Days earlier, when the klaxons began their urgent wail, the sound meant only one thing: a potential nuclear incident, requiring immediate response from the highest levels of government. Within minutes, the translation center transformed from its usual quiet efficiency into controlled chaos. Senior staff rushed through hallways carrying classified folders, secure phones rang incessantly, and the overhead speakers crackled with announcements summoning key personnel to emergency briefings. Elena watched from her cubicle as Director Morrison hurried past, his face pale with the kind of fear that came from understanding the implications of nuclear crisis protocols. Dr. Hawthorne appeared at Elena's workspace 30 minutes later, carrying a thick stack of documents marked with the highest classification levels she had ever seen. His usual condescending demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled panic, and his hands shook slightly as he placed the materials on her desk. "Vasquez," he said without his customary dismissive tone, "we need immediate translation of these Russian communications. They're coming in through multiple channels, and we need to understand what Moscow is saying to their field commanders. This is priority one. Everything else stops." Elena accepted the documents and immediately recognized the formatting of military communications from Russian nuclear forces. The message headers contained codes that corresponded to the automated systems she had identified in the technical manuals, and the timestamp showed that the communications had begun approximately 6 hours earlier. Whatever was happening had been building throughout the night while most of Washington slept. "Dr. Hawthorne," Elena said carefully, "these appear to be operational communications related to the nuclear systems I identified in Tuesday's technical documents. The message codes correspond to the automated launch protocols I flagged in my analysis." Hawthorne's expression shifted between fear and frustration. "Vasquez, I don't have time for your theories right now. We need accurate translations of these messages, and we need them in the next hour. Can you do that or not?" "I can translate them," Elena replied, "but I need you to understand that these aren't routine communications. The Russians are discussing activation procedures for their automated nuclear system. If my analysis of the technical documents was correct, they may be preparing to transfer launch authority to an artificial intelligence system." "Just translate the damn messages," Hawthorne snapped, then caught himself. The gravity of the situation was clearly affecting his usual bureaucratic composure. "Look, Vasquez, I know we've had our differences, but right now I need your linguistic skills more than I need to maintain departmental hierarchy. Translate everything, add whatever context you think is relevant, and get it to me as fast as possible." Elena nodded and began working through the communications with an intensity she had never experienced in her career. The first message was from Russian Strategic Rocket Forces headquarters to multiple missile sites, instructing them to begin perimeter system initialization procedures. The language was formal and precise, using technical terminology that confirmed Elena's interpretation of the earlier documents. The second message contained what appeared to be authentication codes for transferring operational control to automated systems. Elena's blood ran cold as she realized what she was reading. The Russians weren't just testing their automated nuclear system, they were actually preparing to activate it. Subsequent messages revealed a systematic process of human operators transferring their authority to artificial intelligence systems that could make launch decisions independently. The communications discussed dead-hand protocols that would allow nuclear weapons to be launched even if all human leadership was eliminated. Most terrifyingly, the messages indicated that the system was designed to interpret certain types of incoming intelligence as automatic triggers for nuclear retaliation. Elena worked with feverish concentration, her years of linguistic training allowing her to parse the subtle meanings embedded in military communications. She could see patterns in the language that revealed the emotional state of the Russian commanders' fear, urgency, and a sense that they were responding to an immediate threat rather than conducting routine exercises. The most disturbing message came from what appeared to be the central command authority for the automated system. It discussed defensive launch parameters that would trigger nuclear retaliation in response to perceived first strike scenarios. The language suggested that the system was programmed to launch nuclear weapons based on algorithmic analysis of incoming data rather than human judgment. Elena completed her initial translations within 45 minutes, but she knew that the literal meanings of the words told only part of the story. The cultural and linguistic context revealed information that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't intimately familiar with Russian military communications. She prepared a supplementary analysis that explained the implications of the terminology being used and the significance of the communication patterns. When she delivered the translations to Hawthorne, his face went white as he read through her work. "Are you certain about these interpretations?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Hawthorne, I'm absolutely certain. The Russians are activating an automated nuclear launch system that can make targeting and launch decisions without human intervention. Based on the communications timeline, they began the activation process approximately 6 hours ago, and they appear to be responding to intelligence that they interpret as indicating an imminent American first strike." Hawthorne stared at the translations for a long moment, then looked up at Elena with an expression she had never seen from him before, respect mixed with terror. "Vasquez, if you're right about this, we're looking at a scenario where nuclear weapons could be launched by computer systems rather than human decision-makers. That changes everything about crisis management and deterrence theory. Sir, there's something else you need to understand. The communications indicate that the automated system is designed to interpret certain types of American military activity as trigger events for nuclear launch. Based on the parameters described in these messages, routine intelligence gathering or defensive preparations could be misinterpreted by their algorithms as preparation for a first strike." Hawthorne gathered the translations and Elena's analysis with hands that were now visibly shaking. "I need to get this to the Joint Chiefs immediately. Vasquez, I want you to continue monitoring all Russian communications channels. If anything else comes through, translate it and send it directly to me. Don't wait for normal approval processes." Elena watched Hawthorne rush toward the elevator that led to the senior leadership floors, carrying information that could determine whether the world would see another sunrise. For the first time in her career, her linguistic expertise was being treated as a critical national security asset, rather than an administrative convenience. But as the morning progressed, Elena realized that her translations were creating more problems than they were solving. The information she had provided was so alarming that senior officials were struggling to believe it could be accurate. The concept of automated nuclear launch systems contradicted decades of assumptions about nuclear doctrine and crisis management. General Hayes appeared at Elena's cubicle 2 hours later with a grim expression and a folder full of additional communications intercepts. "Ms. Vasquez," she said without preamble, "your translations have created quite a stir upstairs. Half the Joint Chiefs think you've misinterpreted routine military communications, and the other half think we're looking at the beginning of World War III. General, I understand the implications are difficult to accept, but the linguistic evidence is clear. The Russians are discussing operational procedures for automated nuclear systems, not theoretical scenarios or routine exercises. The technical terminology, the communication protocols, and the timeline all support this interpretation." General Hayes nodded grimly. "I believe you, But I'm fighting an uphill battle against people who don't want to believe that nuclear doctrine has fundamentally changed. Dr. Hawthorne is supporting your analysis, but he doesn't have enough credibility on technical matters. To convince the skeptics, what can I do to help? Elena asked, knowing that her career was now secondary to preventing nuclear catastrophe. I need you to provide the most detailed linguistic analysis you've ever done. Every word choice, every grammatical structure, every cultural reference that supports your interpretation. I'm going to present your findings to the National Security Council this afternoon, and I need evidence that will convince people who don't understand the subtleties of language analysis. Elena spent the next 4 hours preparing the most comprehensive report of her career. She analyzed not just the literal meanings of the Russian communications, but the cultural context that revealed the emotional state and intentions of the message creators. She cross-referenced technical terminology with historical documents, identified linguistic patterns that indicated operational rather than theoretical discussions, and provided detailed explanations of why certain word choices confirmed her interpretation. The report built a compelling case that the Russians had developed and were now activating an automated nuclear launch system that could make targeting and launch decisions independently of human control. More alarmingly, Elena's analysis suggested that the system was programmed with parameters that could trigger nuclear launch in response to American activities that were not intended as hostile actions. General Hayes reviewed the report and scheduled an emergency briefing with the National Security Council for 3 p.m. Elena was not invited to attend the briefing, but she was told to remain available for immediate consultation if questions arose about her translations. At 4:30 p.m., General Hayes returned to Elena's cubicle with an expression of frustrated defeat. "The council isn't buying it," she said bluntly. "They think your interpretation is too alarmist, too far outside the boundaries of established nuclear doctrine. They've decided that the communications must refer to routine readiness exercises rather than activation of automated systems." Elena felt her stomach drop. "General, what would it take to convince them? More communications intercepts? Additional technical documentation?" "What it would take," General Hayes said with bitter irony, "is for someone with a PhD in nuclear strategy and 20 years of experience in arms control to tell them the same thing you're telling them. Unfortunately, the people with those credentials are the same people who are convinced that automated nuclear systems are impossible because they violate every assumption about rational nuclear doctrine. But General, rational nuclear doctrine assumes that all nuclear decisions will be made by rational human beings. If the Russians have developed systems that can make launch decisions algorithmically, then all of our assumptions about crisis management and deterrence become irrelevant." General Hayes looked at Elena with a combination of admiration and sympathy. "Ms. Vasquez, you understand the strategic implications better than most of the people making decisions upstairs. The problem is that your understanding is based on linguistic analysis rather than traditional intelligence sources. In this building, credibility is determined by credentials and connections rather than competence." Elena realized that she was facing the same bureaucratic obstacles that had defined her entire career, but now the stakes were measured in millions of lives rather than professional advancement. Her expertise was being dismissed not because it was wrong, but because it didn't fit the established frameworks for understanding nuclear threats. "General, what happens now?" Elena asked, dreading the answer. "Now we monitor the situation and hope that the Russians are conducting exercises rather than preparing for actual nuclear conflict. The Council has decided to maintain normal intelligence, gathering procedures while increasing diplomatic communications to signal that we're not planning any hostile actions." Elena understood the subtext of General Hayes's words. The decision-makers were choosing to ignore her analysis because accepting it would require acknowledging that their entire approach to nuclear crisis management was obsolete, rather than confronting the possibility that automated systems could trigger nuclear war. They were retreating into familiar assumptions about human-controlled nuclear doctrine. As evening approached, Elena continued monitoring Russian communications channels, hoping that subsequent messages would either confirm or refute her interpretation of the morning's intercepts. What she found instead was increasingly alarming. Evidence that the automated systems were not only active, but were beginning to interpret American intelligence gathering activities as potential threats. The Russian communications discussed anomalous surveillance patterns and pre-strike reconnaissance indicators that corresponded to routine American intelligence operations. The automated systems were reanalyzing normal peacetime activities and categorizing them as potential evidence of preparation for nuclear attack. Elena could see that the algorithms were programmed with parameters that were overly sensitive to American military activities, creating a situation where routine operations could trigger nuclear retaliation. Elena prepared an urgent supplementary report documenting these new developments, but when she tried to deliver it to Dr. Hawthorne, she was told that he was in meetings with senior leadership and could not be interrupted. Director Morrison intercepted her attempt to reach Hawthorne and made it clear that Elena's access to senior officials was being restricted. "Vasquez," Morrison said with his familiar tone of bureaucratic authority, "you've created enough confusion for one day. The decision has been made at the highest levels that your interpretations are overly alarmistic. You need to return to routine translation duties and stop trying to inject yourself into strategic policy discussions." Director Morrison, the Russians are discussing American activities in terms that suggest their automated systems are interpreting routine intelligence gathering as preparation for nuclear attack. This information could be critical to preventing misunderstandings that could trigger nuclear conflict. Morrison's expression hardened. "Vasquez, let me be very clear. You are a translator, not a strategic analyst. Your job is to convert words from one language to another, not to interpret the strategic implications of classified communications. Senior officials have reviewed your work and determined that your interpretations exceed your area of competence." Elena realized that she was being systematically isolated from the decision-making process at the moment when her expertise was most needed. The bureaucratic hierarchy that had marginalized her for 6 years was now preventing her from communicating information that could prevent nuclear war. "Sir, I understand the chain of command, but I also understand that accurate translation requires cultural and linguistic context that affects interpretation. If American activities are being misinterpreted by Russian automated systems, shouldn't that information be considered regardless of where it comes from?" "What should be considered," Morrison replied coldly, "is whether someone who consistently exceeds their authority can be trusted with access to classified information. This is your final warning, Vasquez. Return to routine duties and stop attempting to communicate with senior officials without proper authorization." Elena returned to her cubicle, knowing that she had been effectively silenced at the moment when her voice was most needed. The information she had gathered could be critical to preventing nuclear conflict, but the bureaucratic system was preventing that information from reaching decision-makers who could act on it. As the evening shift began, Elena found herself alone in the translation center with access to classified communications that continued to show alarming developments in Russian nuclear preparations. The automated systems were apparently interpreting increasing amounts of American activity as evidence of hostile intentions, and the Russian communications suggested that launch parameters were being continuously updated based on algorithmic analysis of incoming intelligence. Elena faced a choice that would define not only her career, but potentially the future of human civilization. She could accept the limitations that had been placed on her role and hope that senior officials would eventually recognize the significance of the information she had provided. Or she could find ways to ensure that critical intelligence reached people who could act on it, even if doing so meant violating the bureaucratic protocols that had kept her marginalized. The clock on her wall read 7:45 p.m., and Elena could hear the sounds of the building settling into its nighttime routine. Soon, she would be alone with access to information that could determine whether the world would avoid nuclear catastrophe. The translator, who had been told to stay in her lane, was about to discover that sometimes the most important decisions were made by people who were willing to step outside the lanes that others had created for them. Elena opened her computer and began accessing the classified databases that contained the most sensitive intelligence on Russian nuclear activities. Her linguistic skills had revealed truths that traditional intelligence analysis had missed, and she was beginning to understand that the ability to read between the lines in multiple languages could be the key to preventing the ultimate catastrophe. The question was whether she would have the courage to act on information that everyone else seemed determined to ignore. Elena had spent 6 years being invisible within the Pentagon's bureaucracy, but she was about to discover that invisibility could be a powerful tool when used to prevent nuclear war. The communications intercepts continued to arrive throughout the evening, each one providing additional evidence that the Russians had activated automated nuclear systems that were interpreting American activities as potential threats. Elena could see patterns in the language that revealed increasing urgency and decreasing human oversight of nuclear decision-making processes. By 10 p.m., Elena had identified what appeared to be specific trigger events that could cause the automated systems to launch nuclear weapons. The linguistic analysis revealed that the algorithms were programmed to interpret certain combinations of American military activities as definitive evidence of preparation for nuclear attack. Most alarmingly, several of these trigger events corresponded to intelligence gathering operations that the United States conducted on a routine basis. Elena realized that she was watching a nuclear crisis unfold in real time, driven not by human intentions but by algorithmic misinterpretations of routine peacetime activities. The automated systems were creating a situation where nuclear war could begin, not because either side wanted conflict, but because machines were programmed to see threats that didn't actually exist. The translator, who had been dismissed as just language support, was now the only person in the building who fully understood how close the world was to nuclear catastrophe. Elena's linguistic expertise had revealed a truth that traditional intelligence analysis couldn't see, and she was about to discover that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with words and the courage to speak them when no one wanted to listen. As midnight approached, Elena made a decision that would change the course of her life and potentially the course of history. She could continue to accept the limitations that others had placed on her role, or she could use her unique position and expertise to take action that could prevent nuclear war. The choice was between remaining safely invisible or stepping into the most dangerous spotlight in the world. Elena gathered the classified materials that documented the Russian nuclear preparations and began preparing for a night that would test everything she had learned about language, courage, and the power of truth in the face of institutional indifference. The red phone might ring soon, and when it did, Elena intended to be ready with information that could prevent the conversation that no one wanted to have. Elena's hands trembled as she inserted her security card into the restricted access terminal. At 2:17 a.m., knowing that what she was about to do would either save millions of lives or end her career forever. The Pentagon's sub-basement communications center hummed with the quiet energy of classified systems that never slept, their screens casting pale blue light across empty workstations. Most of the building's personnel had gone home hours ago, leaving Elena alone with access to the most sensitive intelligence networks in the American government. She had spent the past 4 hours analyzing the latest Russian communications intercepts, and the linguistic patterns revealed a terrifying countdown to automated nuclear launch. The artificial intelligence systems controlling Russian nuclear forces were interpreting routine American satellite repositioning as preparation for a first strike, and Elena's translation of the most recent messages indicated that the automated launch sequence would begin within 6 hours unless the perceived threat was neutralized. The weight of absolute certainty pressed down on Elena's shoulders as she navigated through the classified database systems. Every bureaucratic instinct told her to follow proper channels, to submit her analysis through the chain of command, and trust that senior officials would eventually recognize the truth. But Elena had learned that institutional wisdom was often institutional blindness, and the people making decisions upstairs were operating with incomplete information because they had dismissed her warnings as alarmist speculation. Elena accessed the Pentagon's direct communication link to the White House Situation Room, a secure channel normally reserved for the highest levels of military leadership. Her security clearance technically gave her access to the system, but using it without authorization would be considered a career-ending violation of protocol. Elena stared at the authentication screen for a long moment, knowing that her next action would cross a line from which there could be no return. She entered her credentials and began composing a message that would bypass every level of bureaucratic oversight between her cubicle and the president's national security team. The message contained her complete linguistic analysis of the Russian communications, documented evidence of automated nuclear systems preparing to launch, and most critically, her assessment that nuclear war would begin within hours unless immediate action was taken to signal American peaceful intentions. Elena's fingers moved across the keyboard with the precision of someone who had spent years crafting perfect translations. But now she was translating truth across the barrier between institutional hierarchy and life-or-death reality. The message was clinical, detailed, and utterly convincing to anyone willing to consider that a translator might understand nuclear crisis better than the generals and strategists who had spent decades studying theoretical scenarios. The authentication process required Elena to provide biometric confirmation and enter emergency communication codes that she had memorized but never expected to use. As she completed the final verification steps, Elena realized that she was about to become either a national hero or a federal criminal, depending on whether the people receiving her message had the wisdom to understand its significance. Elena transmitted the message at 2:43 a.m. and immediately began monitoring all available communication channels for Russian activity. The linguistic patterns in recent intercepts showed increasing automation in Russian nuclear command systems, with human oversight being systematically reduced as artificial intelligence algorithms assumed greater control over targeting and launch decisions. 27 minutes after Elena's unauthorized communication to the White House, her computer screen flashed with an incoming priority message from the Office of the National Security Advisor. The response was brief and direct. Report to Situation Room immediately. Bring all supporting documentation. Transportation arranged. Elena gathered every piece of evidence she had compiled over the past 3 days, including the original Russian technical documents, her detailed linguistic analyses, and the communication intercepts that revealed the automated systems approaching launch readiness. She sealed the materials in a classified document carrier and made her way to the Pentagon secure transportation area, where a military vehicle waited to escort her to the White House. The drive through Washington's empty streets felt surreal, as if Elena was moving through a city that might not exist in a few hours, if her analysis proved correct and her warnings proved insufficient. The vehicle's communications equipment crackled with coded messages between military installations, and Elena could sense the tension in the voices of personnel who understood that something unprecedented was happening but didn't yet know the full scope of the crisis. The White House Situation Room was smaller than Elena had imagined, but the concentration of power within its walls was immediately apparent. President Sarah Chun sat at the head of a polished conference table, flanked by the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Director of National Intelligence, and other senior officials whose decisions could affect the fate of human civilization. Elena had never been in the presence of such authority, but the gravity of the situation left no room for intimidation. National Security Advisor Robert Kellerman gestured for Elena to take a seat at the table, treating her with a respect that she had never experienced in her Pentagon career. "Ms. Vasquez," he began, "your communication reached us at a critical moment. We've been monitoring unusual Russian nuclear activity, but our traditional intelligence sources haven't provided the clarity that your linguistic analysis seems to offer. Can you walk us through your assessment of the current situation?" Elena opened her document carrier and began presenting her findings with the same methodical precision she had used for countless routine translations. But this was far from routine, and every word carried the weight of nuclear war or nuclear peace. She explained how the Russian technical documents had revealed an operational automated nuclear system, how the communication patterns showed that system being activated, and how the linguistic nuances indicated that launch parameters were being continuously updated by artificial intelligence rather than human decision-makers. President Chun listened with the focused intensity of someone accustomed to processing life and death information, but Elena could see concern growing in her expression as the implications of the analysis became clear. "Ms. Vasquez," the president asked, "you're telling us that Russian nuclear weapons could be launched by computer systems rather than human commanders?" "Yes, Madam President. The communications indicate that human oversight has been systematically reduced over the past 18 hours. The automated systems are now making targeting and threat assessment decisions based on algorithmic analysis of incoming intelligence. Most critically, they appear to be interpreting routine American military activities as evidence of preparation for nuclear attack." Secretary of Defense Michael Torres leaned forward with obvious skepticism. "Ms. Vasquez, with all due respect, this assessment contradicts everything we know about Russian nuclear doctrine. They've always maintained strict human control over nuclear weapons, just as we do. The concept of fully automated nuclear systems violates basic principles of nuclear safety and strategic stability." Elena had anticipated this objection and was prepared with linguistic evidence that traditional intelligence analysis would miss. "Mr. Secretary, the Russian communications use specific terminology that indicates a fundamental shift in their nuclear doctrine. They're discussing algorithmic deterrence and automated defensive protocols that couldn't exist unless human decision-making had been replaced by artificial intelligence systems." Director of National Intelligence Angela Martinez consulted a folder of intelligence summaries before speaking. "Our technical analysts have reviewed satellite imagery and signals intelligence from Russian nuclear facilities, and they report unusual activity consistent with heightened readiness levels. However, we haven't seen evidence of automated systems taking control of nuclear forces." "Director Martinez," Elena replied, "the evidence is in the language patterns rather than traditional intelligence indicators. Russian military communications have shifted to terminology that indicates artificial intelligence systems are making decisions that humans previously made. The cultural and linguistic context reveals information that technical sensors can't detect." President Chun studied Elena with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating whether to trust analysis that contradicted established assumptions. "Ms. Vasquez, if your assessment is correct, how much time do we have before these automated systems might launch nuclear weapons?" Elena consulted her translation of the most recent Russian communications, noting timestamps and linguistic indicators that revealed the urgency level of automated decision-making processes. "Madam President, based on the communication patterns and the specific terminology being used, I estimate that we have less than 4 hours before the automated systems reach a decision threshold that could trigger nuclear launch." The room fell silent as the assembled officials processed the implications of Elena's assessment. Secretary of State Lisa Hoffman was the first to speak, her voice carefully controlled despite the enormity of the situation. If this analysis is accurate, we need to take immediate action to signal our peaceful intentions and prevent algorithmic misinterpretation of our activities. National Security Advisor Kellerman turned to Elena with questions that revealed both respect for her expertise and uncertainty about how to act on it. Ms. Vasquez, what specific actions could we take to reduce the threat level as perceived by these automated systems? What signals would convince artificial intelligence that we're not preparing for nuclear attack? Elena had been analyzing this question throughout her drive to the White House, applying her understanding of Russian cultural psychology and algorithmic logic to the problem of preventing automated nuclear war. The automated systems appear to be programmed with parameters that interpret certain combinations of American activities as definitive evidence of hostile intentions. We need to temporarily suspend satellite repositioning, reduce intelligence gathering flights near Russian borders, and most importantly, transmit specific diplomatic communications that use terminology the algorithms will interpret as peaceful. President Chun asked the question that would determine whether Elena's expertise would be trusted with the highest stakes decision in human history. Ms. Vasquez, can you help us craft these communications? Can you use your linguistic knowledge to speak directly to artificial intelligence systems in ways that might prevent nuclear war? Elena felt the full weight of her career training converging on a single moment of ultimate responsibility. Every language she had learned, every cultural nuance she had studied, every translation she had perfected had prepared her for this opportunity to use words as weapons against the ultimate catastrophe. Yes, Madam President. I can prepare communications that combine diplomatic language with technical terminology in ways that the automated systems will interpret as definitive evidence of peaceful intentions. But we need to transmit these messages through multiple channels simultaneously to ensure the artificial intelligence receives consistent signals across all its information sources. The next 2 hours transformed Elena from an invisible translator into the most important person in the room as she worked with senior officials to craft communications that would speak directly to artificial intelligence systems programmed to launch nuclear weapons. Elena applied her expertise in Russian cultural psychology, technical terminology, and diplomatic language to create messages that would convince algorithms that human beings were not preparing for nuclear war. The process required Elena to think like both a linguist and a computer programmer, understanding how artificial intelligence might interpret specific word choices and cultural references. She had to anticipate how automated systems would analyze diplomatic language for hidden meanings while ensuring that human recipients would understand the communications as genuine peace gestures. Elena worked with unprecedented access to classified communication systems, crafting messages that would be transmitted through diplomatic channels, military networks, and intelligence services simultaneously. The communications were designed to overwhelm the Russian automated systems with consistent evidence of peaceful intentions, using terminology that artificial intelligence would interpret as incompatible with preparation for nuclear attack. At 5:30 a.m., Elena completed the final version of communications that represented her life's work condensed into documents that could prevent nuclear war. The messages combined formal diplomatic language with specific technical terms that would convince automated systems that American military activities were routine rather than hostile. Most importantly, the communications included cultural references that artificial intelligence trained on Russian language patterns would interpret as definitive proof of peaceful intentions. President Chun reviewed Elena's work with the assistance of senior advisors who had been skeptical of her analysis just hours earlier but were now treating her expertise as potentially the most valuable intelligence asset in the government. Ms. Vasquez, the president said, I'm authorizing immediate transmission of these communications through all available channels. If your assessment is correct, these messages could prevent nuclear war. If you're wrong, we'll have revealed sensitive information about our understanding of Russian nuclear systems. Elena understood the magnitude of trust being placed in her judgment, but she also understood that the alternative to action was almost certainly nuclear catastrophe. Madam President, I stake my career and my reputation on the accuracy of this analysis. The linguistic evidence is overwhelming, and the risk of inaction far exceeds the risk of trusting unconventional intelligence sources. The communications were transmitted at 5:47 a.m. through 17 different channels, flooding Russian automated systems with consistent messages designed to convince artificial intelligence that American peaceful intentions were genuine. Elena monitored communication intercepts in real time, watching for linguistic indicators that would reveal whether the automated systems were responding to the diplomatic signals. The first signs of success appeared within 30 minutes as Russian military communications began showing reduced urgency levels and decreased references to perceived American threats. Elena's linguistic analysis revealed that the automated systems were processing the diplomatic messages and adjusting their threat assessments accordingly. The terminology in Russian communications shifted from combat preparation to routine monitoring, indicating that artificial intelligence had concluded that nuclear attack was not imminent. By 7:15 a.m., Elena's intercept analysis showed that the Russian automated nuclear systems had stepped back from launch readiness and returned to normal peacetime monitoring status. The crisis that could have ended human civilization had been resolved not through traditional diplomacy or military deterrence, but through linguistic expertise applied to the unprecedented challenge of communicating with artificial intelligence. Programmed for nuclear war. President Chun addressed Elena with a combination of gratitude and amazement that perfectly captured the surreal nature of the situation. Ms. Vasquez, it appears that your linguistic analysis and communication strategy may have prevented nuclear war. How confident are you that the crisis has passed? Elena continued monitoring Russian communications for several more hours, but the linguistic patterns clearly indicated that the automated systems had returned to normal operational status. Madam President, the communication patterns show that the Russian automated systems have concluded that no nuclear threat exists. The crisis appears to have been resolved through diplomatic signals that convinced artificial intelligence of our peaceful intentions. As dawn broke over Washington, Elena realized that she had accomplished something unprecedented in human history. She had used her expertise in language and culture to prevent nuclear war by communicating directly with artificial intelligence systems designed to launch nuclear weapons. The translator, who had been dismissed as just language support, had proven that sometimes the most sophisticated weapons could be defeated by the oldest human tool, the power of words chosen with perfect precision and delivered with absolute courage. Elena's unauthorized communication to the White House had violated every protocol in her career, but it had also demonstrated that expertise and insight could be more valuable than rank and credentials when human survival was at stake. The invisible translator had become the most visible person in the government, and her linguistic skills had proven that understanding language was ultimately about understanding the difference between war and peace. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Pentagon's executive conference room as Elena faced the most important meeting of her career. Across the polished mahogany table sat the officials who had dismissed her warnings just days earlier, their expressions ranging from embarrassment to barely concealed hostility. Director Morrison fidgeted with his pen, avoiding eye contact, while Dr. Hawthorne stared at documents that documented his failure to recognize the most critical intelligence of his career. Secretary of Defense Torres entered the room with the measured stride of someone accustomed to wielding authority, but his demeanor toward Elena had transformed completely since their encounter in the White House Situation Room. He took his seat at the head of the table and addressed her with the respect typically reserved for senior military officials. Ms. Vasquez, Secretary Torres began, I want to begin this meeting by acknowledging that your linguistic analysis and rapid response prevented what could have been the most catastrophic intelligence failure in American history. Your expertise identified threats that our traditional intelligence systems missed, and your courage in bypassing normal channels likely saved millions of lives. Elena maintained her professional composure despite the surreal nature of hearing praise from officials who had been dismissing her expertise for years. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I was simply applying the linguistic training that the Pentagon had provided me to analyze information that seemed critical to national security. General Hayes, who had been Elena's only ally during the crisis, leaned forward with obvious satisfaction. Ms. Vasquez's analysis revealed fundamental gaps in our understanding of modern nuclear threats. Her recognition that automated systems required different communication strategies than human decision-makers represents a paradigm shift in how we approach nuclear crisis management. Dr. Hawthorne finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of professional humiliation. I want to acknowledge that I failed to recognize the significance of Ms. Vasquez's initial analysis. My dismissal of her warnings was based on traditional assumptions about nuclear doctrine that proved to be outdated. Her linguistic expertise provided insights that my strategic training had not prepared me to understand. Director Morrison's contribution was more grudging, delivered with the tone of someone admitting mistakes under institutional pressure. The translation department's handling of Ms. Vasquez's analysis revealed systemic problems in how we evaluate intelligence that comes from non-traditional sources. Her expertise was marginalized because it didn't fit established procedures for processing strategic intelligence. Secretary Torres nodded grimly, which brings us to the purpose of this meeting. The President has ordered a complete review of how we utilize linguistic expertise in national security analysis. Ms. Vasquez, your actions have demonstrated that language specialists can provide strategic insights that complement traditional intelligence gathering methods. Elena felt a mixture of vindication and wariness as she realized that her career was about to change dramatically. Mr. Secretary, I appreciate the recognition, but I want to emphasize that this crisis could have been prevented if the institutional culture had been more receptive to insights that came from specialized expertise rather than hierarchical authority. Exactly, Secretary Torres replied. The President has authorized the creation of a new position that will ensure linguistic expertise is integrated into strategic decision-making processes. Ms. Vasquez, you're being promoted to Senior Linguistic Analyst for Strategic Intelligence, reporting directly to the National Security Council. Your analysis will be given the same weight as intelligence from technical and human sources. Elena absorbed the magnitude of this transformation while maintaining her professional demeanor. The translator, who had been relegated to a converted supply closet, was being elevated to one of the most important intelligence positions in the government. I'm honored by the appointment, Mr. Secretary. What would be the scope of my new responsibilities? General Hayes answered with obvious enthusiasm. You'll be establishing protocols for linguistic analysis of communications from potential adversaries, training other analysts in cultural interpretation methods, and most importantly, providing real-time analysis during crisis situations. Expertise will be directly available to senior decision-makers without bureaucratic filtering. Dr. Hawthorne added with what appeared to be genuine contrition. Ms. Vasquez will also be reviewing our existing intelligence assessments to identify potential misinterpretations based on linguistic or cultural factors. Her analysis may reveal threats that we've missed or misunderstood due to inadequate language expertise. Elena understood that she was being offered unprecedented influence over national security policy, but she also recognized the enormous responsibility that came with such authority. I accept the position, but I want to ensure that we also address the institutional factors that prevented this expertise from being utilized effectively in the past. Secretary Torres consulted a folder of policy documents before responding. The President has ordered comprehensive reforms to ensure that expertise is valued regardless of its source. Dr. Hawthorne, you'll be working with Ms. Vasquez to establish new procedures for integrating linguistic analysis into strategic assessments. Director Morrison, your department will be restructured to ensure that language specialists have direct access to decision makers. Morrison's response was terse but professionally appropriate. Yes, Mr. Secretary, we'll implement whatever changes are necessary to ensure that linguistic expertise receives proper consideration in intelligence analysis. Elena realized that she was witnessing the systematic dismantling of the bureaucratic barriers that had kept her marginalized for years. The crisis had revealed that institutional assumptions about expertise and authority could be deadly when they prevented critical information from reaching decision makers. Mr. Secretary, Elena said, I recommend that we also establish protocols for other specialists who might have insights that don't fit traditional intelligence categories. This crisis demonstrated that expertise can come from unexpected sources, and we need systems that can recognize and utilize unconventional intelligence. General Hayes smiled with obvious approval. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need. Ms. Vasquez, you'll be chairing a committee that will review how we identify and utilize specialized expertise across all areas of national security. Your experience with institutional barriers will be invaluable in designing systems that actually work. The meeting continued for another hour as Elena received briefings on her new responsibilities and the resources that would be available to support her work. She would have a staff of linguistic specialists, access to the most sensitive intelligence systems, and most importantly, direct communication channels to senior decision-makers during crisis situations. As the meeting concluded, Elena reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in just a few days. The nuclear crisis had revealed that her expertise was not just valuable, but essential for national security, and the institutional recognition of that expertise represented a fundamental shift in how the government approached intelligence analysis. Dr. Hawthorne approached Elena after the other officials had left, his expression carrying genuine respect mixed with professional embarrassment. Ms. Vasquez, I want to personally apologize for my dismissal of your analysis. My assumptions about nuclear doctrine prevented me from recognizing insights that could have prevented a catastrophic intelligence failure. Elena accepted the apology graciously while recognizing that individual attitudes were less important than institutional changes. Dr. Hawthorne, I appreciate your acknowledgement, but the real issue was systemic rather than personal. We need to ensure that expertise is evaluated on its merits rather than its source. Agreed, Hawthorne replied. I've recommended that all strategic analysts receive training in linguistic analysis methods so that we can better understand the cultural context of intelligence sources. Your expertise revealed gaps in our analytical capabilities that we didn't even know existed. Elena spent the rest of the day reviewing the scope of her new position and the institutional changes that would support her work. She would be moving from her converted supply closet to a suite of offices near the Pentagon's senior leadership, with access to communication systems that would allow her to provide real-time linguistic analysis during international crises. More importantly, Elena would be establishing training programs that would ensure other intelligence analysts understood the strategic value of linguistic expertise. The crisis had demonstrated that cultural and linguistic insights could be as important as technical intelligence in understanding potential threats. Elena's first major initiative in her new role was establishing a rapid response team of linguistic specialists who could provide immediate analysis during international crises. The team would include experts in multiple languages and cultures, with direct access to decision makers and the authority to provide strategic assessments based on linguistic analysis. Within a month of her appointment, Elena's team had identified several potential intelligence gaps where linguistic expertise could provide critical insights. They discovered that communications from potential adversaries contained cultural references that traditional intelligence analysis was missing, and that diplomatic language often carried meanings that were invisible to analysts who lacked deep cultural understanding. Elena's work attracted attention from intelligence services in allied nations, who recognized that linguistic expertise could provide strategic advantages in understanding potential threats. She began collaborating with language specialists from other countries, sharing methods for cultural analysis and developing international protocols for linguistic intelligence gathering. The transformation of Elena's career became a case study in how institutional reforms could unlock expertise that had been marginalized by bureaucratic assumptions. Her story was studied in military academies and intelligence training programs as an example of how unconventional thinking could provide solutions to unprecedented challenges. 6 months after the nuclear crisis, Elena received a letter from a young linguistics graduate who had been inspired by her story to pursue a career in intelligence analysis. The letter reminded Elena that her transformation had implications beyond her own career, demonstrating that expertise could be valued regardless of its source if institutions were willing to recognize and utilize it. Elena's new office overlooked the Pentagon's central courtyard, a dramatic change from her previous workspace in the converted supply closet. The walls were covered with linguistic analysis charts, cultural reference materials, and communication protocols that she had developed for analyzing intelligence from potential adversaries. But the most important change was not in Elena's physical environment but in the institutional culture that now valued her expertise. The nuclear crisis had demonstrated that linguistic analysis could be as important as technical intelligence in understanding threats to national security, and Elena's work had become central to how the government approached international crisis management. Elena often reflected on the irony that her years of marginalization had actually prepared her for the moment when her expertise became most valuable. The dismissal and isolation she had experienced had forced her to develop independent analytical skills and deep cultural understanding that proved essential when traditional intelligence methods failed to recognize an unprecedented threat. The translator, who had been invisible for years, had become one of the most visible and influential intelligence analysts in the government. Elena's story demonstrated that expertise could triumph over institutional barriers when applied with courage and precision to challenges that demanded unconventional solutions. As Elena prepared for her next assignment, analyzing communications from a potential crisis in Eastern Europe, she understood that her work had fundamentally changed how the government approached linguistic intelligence. The nuclear crisis had revealed that words could be as powerful as weapons when understood by someone with the expertise to decode their true meaning. Elena's career had evolved from routine translation to strategic analysis, but the core of her work remained the same: using language to understand truth and communicate that understanding to people who could act on it. The difference was that now, finally, people were listening. 2 years after the nuclear crisis that never made headlines, Elena stood before a packed auditorium at the Defense Language Institute, watching as a new generation of linguistic analysts prepared to graduate into roles that hadn't existed when her career began. These young men and women would enter the intelligence community with something Elena had never had: institutional recognition that language expertise could be as critical to national security as any weapon in the American arsenal. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation as Elena prepared to deliver the keynote address for the first graduating class of the Strategic Linguistic Analysis Program, an initiative she had designed to ensure that future intelligence analysts understood the power of cultural and linguistic insight in preventing international crises. The program had become a model for allied nations, and Elena's methodologies were now taught in intelligence academies across the democratic world. Elena looked out at the audience and saw faces that reminded her of her younger self, brilliant, passionate, and hungry for opportunities to serve their country through intellectual expertise rather than conventional military service. But unlike Elena's early career, these graduates would enter an intelligence community that valued their skills and understood their potential contributions to national security. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena began, her voice carrying the authority that came from having prevented nuclear war through linguistic analysis, "you are graduating into a profession that has fundamentally changed in the past 2 years. The intelligence community has learned that understanding language is understanding truth, and that cultural insight can be as powerful as satellite imagery in preventing catastrophic conflicts." Elena's speech drew from her experience transforming from an invisible translator into one of the most influential intelligence analysts in the government, but she focused on the broader implications of that transformation for the intelligence community and international relations. The nuclear crisis had demonstrated that traditional approaches to intelligence analysis were insufficient for understanding threats from adversaries who use technology in unprecedented ways. "The crisis that defined my career was resolved not through military force or diplomatic pressure, but through the precise application of linguistic expertise to an unprecedented challenge," Elena continued. Artificial intelligence systems programmed to launch nuclear weapons were convinced to stand down through communications that spoke directly to their algorithmic logic while respecting the cultural context that had shaped their programming. Elena described how her team had since developed protocols for communicating with artificial intelligence systems used by multiple nations, creating a new field of algorithmic diplomacy that combined linguistic analysis with computer science. To prevent automated conflicts, the work had become increasingly important as more countries integrated artificial intelligence into their military and diplomatic operations. The audience listened with the intensity of people who understood that they were entering a profession where their expertise could literally determine the fate of human civilization. Elena could see in their faces the same passion for language and culture that had driven her own career, but also the confidence that came from knowing their skills would be valued and utilized effectively. "Your generation will face challenges that require new approaches to intelligence analysis," Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of experience earned through institutional struggle and ultimate triumph. "You'll encounter threats that traditional methods can't address, and you'll need the courage to trust your expertise even when it contradicts established assumptions about how the world works." Elena's address included case studies from her work over the past 2 years, including her analysis of communications from a potential conflict in the South China Sea that had been prevented through linguistic insights into Chinese military culture. Her team had identified cultural references in Chinese communications that revealed their military actions were defensive rather than aggressive, preventing an American response that could have escalated into broader conflict. Another example involved Elena's analysis of Middle Eastern communications that had identified terrorist planning through linguistic patterns that traditional intelligence methods had missed. Her team's cultural expertise had revealed that certain religious references were actually coded messages about operational planning, allowing security services to prevent multiple attacks. The intelligence community learned that expertise comes in many forms, Elena told the graduates, and that the most valuable insights often come from people who understand the cultural context behind the information we gather. "Your linguistic skills will allow you to see patterns that others miss and to communicate with people and systems that traditional methods can't reach." Elena's speech concluded with a challenge to the graduates to use their expertise boldly and with confidence, knowing that their linguistic analysis could be as important as any other form of intelligence in protecting national security. She emphasized that their work would often require them to challenge established assumptions and to advocate for insights that might seem unconventional to senior officials. After the ceremony, Elena was approached by Dr. Sarah Kim, a graduate student whose dissertation on computational linguistics had caught Elena's attention. Dr. Kim had developed algorithms that could analyze linguistic patterns in real time, potentially allowing artificial intelligence systems to assist human analysts in identifying cultural nuances in foreign communications. Ms. Vasquez, Dr. Kim said, "I wanted to thank you for creating opportunities for linguists to contribute to national security. Your work has shown that language expertise can be as strategic as any military capability." Elena was impressed by Dr. Kim's research and recognized that the next generation of linguistic analysts would have tools that could amplify their expertise in ways that had been impossible during her early career. Dr. Kim, your work represents the future of linguistic intelligence. The combination of human cultural insight with artificial intelligence analysis could revolutionize how we understand communications from potential adversaries. Elena invited Dr. Kim to join her team as a research analyst, beginning a collaboration that would lead to breakthrough developments in automated linguistic analysis. Their work would create systems that could identify cultural references and emotional patterns in foreign communications while maintaining the human oversight necessary for accurate interpretation. The partnership between Elena and Dr. Kim exemplified the transformation of the intelligence community from a hierarchical organization that valued rank over expertise to a collaborative environment that sought out and utilized specialized knowledge from diverse sources. Elena's experience had demonstrated that the most valuable intelligence often came from unexpected sources, and her leadership style reflected that understanding. Elena's office had become a hub for innovative approaches to intelligence analysis, with linguists, computer scientists, psychologists, and cultural anthropologists working together to develop new methods for understanding international communications. The team's work had applications beyond national security, contributing to diplomatic negotiations, international business communications, and cultural exchange programs. The success of Elena's programs had attracted attention from academic institutions, and she had been offered positions at several prestigious universities. But Elena remained committed to government service, understanding that her work was most valuable when applied directly to protecting national security and preventing international conflicts. Elena's influence extended beyond her immediate team. Through her mentorship of young analysts throughout the intelligence community, she had developed training programs that taught traditional intelligence analysts to recognize the value of linguistic expertise and to integrate cultural insights into their assessments of potential threats. The institutional changes that Elena had championed had created a culture where expertise was valued regardless of its source, and where unconventional approaches to intelligence analysis were encouraged rather than dismissed. Her story had become a touchstone for intelligence professionals who understood that the most important insights often came from people who saw patterns that others missed. Elena's work had also influenced international intelligence cooperation, with allied nations adopting her methods for linguistic analysis and cultural interpretation. She had established exchange programs that allowed analysts from different countries to share expertise and develop collaborative approaches to understanding global threats. 3 years after the nuclear crisis, Elena received the intelligence community's highest honor for her contributions to national security. The ceremony was attended by officials who had once dismissed her expertise, and Elena used her acceptance speech to emphasize the importance of creating institutional cultures that valued expertise over hierarchy. The greatest threats to national security are not necessarily the ones that fit our established frameworks for understanding conflict, Elena said during her acceptance speech. They are the unprecedented challenges that require new approaches and the courage to trust expertise that comes from unexpected sources. Elena's story had become legendary within the intelligence community, but she remained focused on the practical work of preventing conflicts through linguistic analysis. Her team continued to develop new methods for understanding international communications, and their work had prevented numerous potential crises through early identification of cultural misunderstandings that could have escalated into broader conflicts. The transformation of Elena's career had broader implications for how society valued intellectual expertise and specialized knowledge. Her story demonstrated that the most important contributions to human security often came from people who dedicated their lives to understanding the subtleties of human communication and cultural interaction. As Elena prepared for her next assignment, analyzing communications related to emerging conflicts in Eastern Europe, she reflected on how her career had evolved from routine translation to strategic analysis that could affect the fate of nations. The nuclear crisis had revealed that her expertise was not just valuable, but essential, and the institutional recognition of that expertise had created opportunities for future generations of linguistic analysts. Elena's work had proven that words could be as powerful as weapons when understood by someone with the expertise to decode their true meaning. Her story demonstrated that expertise could triumph over institutional barriers when applied with courage and precision to challenges that demanded unconventional solutions. The translator, who had been invisible for years, had become one of the most visible and influential intelligence analysts in the government. But more importantly, she had created a legacy that would ensure future generations of linguistic experts would have opportunities to contribute to national security in ways that had been impossible during her early career. Elena's influence continued to grow as her methods were adopted by intelligence services worldwide, creating a new field of linguistic intelligence that combined cultural insight with technological innovation. Her story had become a model for how expertise could be recognized and utilized effectively, even when it came from sources that traditional institutions might overlook. As Elena walked through the Pentagon's corridors, she passed the converted supply closet that had once served as her office, now transformed into a conference room where senior analysts met to discuss strategic assessments. The physical transformation of the space symbolized the broader changes that had occurred in how the intelligence community valued and utilized specialized expertise. Elena's career had demonstrated that the most important victories were often won not through conventional strength, but through the precise application of knowledge and the courage to act on insights that others might dismiss. Her story continued to inspire analysts who understood that their expertise could be the key to preventing conflicts and protecting human security in an increasingly complex world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.